What if I told you that the fastest ships to ever cross the Atlantic weren't built by the British Royal Navy, weren't engineered by elite European shipwrights, and weren't even legal? What if the secret to dominating the ocean wasn't found in any Naval Academy textbook, but was deliberately erased from history because it threatened the most powerful empires on Earth? The ships I'm about to reveal to you were so fast, so revolutionary, that governments tried to bury their existence. They couldn't be caught, they couldn't be stopped, and the men who built them weren't supposed to exist in the official records. Today, I'm exposing the censored truth about the vessels that changed maritime history forever. Before we dive into this forbidden chapter of naval history, hit that subscribe button and smash the like if you're ready to discover secrets they don't teach in history class. Trust me, what you're about to learn will completely change how you see the age of sail. Let me take you back to the early 1800s. The Atlantic Ocean was the highway of global commerce, but it was also a battleground. Nations fought for control of trade routes. Fortunes were made and lost on the waves. And in the middle of all this chaos, there was one type of ship that ruled them all. I'm talking about the Baltimore Clipper. Now, you might have heard of clipper ships before. The tall, majestic vessels with clouds of white sails that could cross oceans at breathtaking speeds. But the Baltimore Clipper was different. It was the original, the prototype, the ship that broke all the rules and rewrote maritime engineering. But here's the thing nobody talks about. These ships were designed specifically for illegal activities. Yes, you heard that right. The fastest ships in the Atlantic were purpose-built for smuggling, privateering, and evading naval blockades. They were the performance vehicles of their era, designed not for cargo capacity or naval warfare, but for pure, unadulterated speed. Think about that for a moment. While European naval architects were focused on building warships with maximum firepower and merchant vessels with maximum cargo space, a group of brilliant but largely unrecognized shipbuilders in Baltimore, Maryland, were creating something entirely different. They were building ships that could outrun anything on the ocean. The illegal advantage wasn't just about breaking the law, it was about breaking the paradigm of what a ship could be. Traditional ship design in the 1700s and early 1800s followed a conservative formula. Ships were built wide and deep to carry as much cargo as possible or to mount as many cannons as they could bear. Speed was secondary, stability was everything. The thinking was simple: better to arrive slowly with your cargo intact than to risk everything for speed. But the Baltimore Clipper designers asked a different question. What if speed was the cargo? What if the ability to outrun British warships, dodge pirate vessels, and slip through naval blockades was more valuable than anything you could store in a hold? What if being untouchable was the ultimate maritime advantage? This question led to a revolutionary design philosophy. Every single element of the Baltimore Clipper was optimized for speed. The hull was long and narrow, slicing through water rather than pushing it aside. The bow was sharp and raked dramatically forward, cutting through waves with minimal resistance. The stern was equally sharp, reducing drag as water flowed past. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Baltimore Clipper had what naval architects call an extreme dead rise. This means the bottom of the hull formed a sharp V shape rather than the flat or rounded bottoms common in other ships. This design allowed the ship to heel over dramatically when sailing close to the wind, reducing the wetted surface area and increasing speed even further. In modern terms, imagine the difference between a speedboat and a cargo barge. The Baltimore Clipper was the speedboat of the age of sail, while most other vessels were floating warehouses. And this design didn't just make them fast, it made them agile. A Baltimore Clipper could tack and maneuver in ways that left pursuing warships floundering. They could sail closer to the wind, meaning they could make progress even when the wind wasn't favorable. They could operate in shallow coastal waters where deep-hulled warships couldn't follow. This illegal advantage transformed everything. During the War of 1812, American privateers sailing Baltimore clippers captured or destroyed hundreds of British merchant vessels, causing economic damage that far exceeded their small numbers. During the years when the international slave trade was officially banned, but still incredibly profitable, Baltimore clippers became the preferred vessels for slave traders who needed to outrun anti-slavery patrol ships. And here's the uncomfortable truth that history books tend to gloss over. Some of the most innovative maritime engineering of the 19th century came directly from the needs of illegal enterprises. The Baltimore Clippers' design principles would later influence the California Clippers of the Gold Rush era, and eventually the famous tea clippers that raced from China to London. But all of this innovation came with a cost. The very characteristics that made Baltimore clippers so fast also made them dangerous. The narrow hull and extreme dead rise meant these ships had relatively little stability. They required expert seamanship to handle safely. In rough seas or poor weather, they could be downright treacherous. The illegal advantage that changed everything wasn't just a technological innovation. It was a complete reimagining of what a ship could be and what it could do. It was the maritime equivalent of choosing a sports car over a truck, performance over payload, risk over safety. And it worked. For decades, Baltimore clippers dominated the Atlantic, outrunning every attempt to stop them, capturing vessels that thought themselves safe and slipping through blockades that were supposed to be impenetrable. But who were the people behind these revolutionary vessels? That's where our story gets even more interesting and even more suppressed. Now here's where the historical censorship really begins. When you read mainstream maritime history, you'll find plenty of information about famous British naval architects like Robert Seppings or French designers like Jacques-Noël Sanet. You'll learn about the great shipyards of Portsmouth and Toulon, but try to find detailed information about the men who designed the Baltimore Clipper and you'll hit a wall of silence. Why? Because many of them were working-class craftsmen, immigrants, and in some cases, people operating outside the bounds of polite society. They weren't connected to naval academies or royal courts. They didn't publish treatises on ship design or seek patents for their innovations. They built ships in small private yards, often working from experience and intuition rather than formal engineering principles. This was folk engineering at its finest, practical knowledge passed down through apprenticeships and refined through trial and error. And because it didn't fit the narrative of how innovation was supposed to happen, it was systematically written out of history. Let me tell you about some of these hidden designers, the ones I've been able to piece together from fragmented records and obscure sources. First, there's Thomas Kemp. Now, Kemp is actually one of the few Baltimore Clipper designers who did achieve some recognition, but even his story has been largely forgotten. Kemp established one of the most successful shipyards in Fells Point, Baltimore, in the early 1800s. He built dozens of schooners and brigs that became legendary for their speed. But here's what's fascinating about Kemp. He wasn't trained in any formal school. He learned shipbuilding through hands-on experience, and he developed his design principles through observation and experimentation. He would watch how his ships performed, note what worked and what didn't, and continuously refine his approach. Kemp built the Chasseur, a Baltimore clipper that became known as the Pride of Baltimore. During the War of 1812, the Chasseur captured or sank numerous British vessels and even had the audacity to declare a mock blockade of the entire British Isles. The British were so frustrated by this single ship that they offered a substantial reward for its capture, but the Chasseur was simply too fast to catch. Then there's the story of the French-trained shipwrights who fled to Baltimore during the turmoil of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. These craftsmen brought with them knowledge of European ship design, but adapted it to American conditions and needs. They blended French design elegance with American pragmatism, creating something entirely new. Many of these French shipwrights worked anonymously or under anglicized names to avoid political complications. Their contributions to Baltimore clipper design are largely undocumented, hidden beneath layers of historical obscurity. We also need to talk about the African-American shipwrights who played crucial roles in Baltimore's shipbuilding industry. This is an aspect of maritime history that has been almost completely erased, but the evidence exists if you know where to look. Baltimore in the early 1800s had a significant population of free African Americans, and many worked in skilled trades, including shipbuilding. They worked as caulkers, sailmakers, carpenters, and in some cases as master craftsmen. Their knowledge and skills were essential to the success of Baltimore's shipyards, but their names rarely appear in official records. Why? Because acknowledging their contributions didn't fit the racial narratives of the time or the decades that followed. It was more convenient to pretend that innovative ship design was the exclusive domain of white European-descended craftsmen. Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist and former slave, actually worked as a ship caulker in Baltimore before he escaped to freedom. In his writings, he describes the sophisticated skills required in shipbuilding and the pride that craftsmen took in their work. He also describes the racial tensions and violence that African-American shipyard workers faced, culminating in riots that eventually drove many of them out of the trade. The hidden designers of the Baltimore Clipper also included practical sailors who provided feedback and ideas to shipbuilders. Privateer captains and merchant sailors who had experience with how ships actually performed at sea would work with shipbuilders to refine designs. This collaborative approach, where theory met practice, was a key factor in the Baltimore Clipper's success. But this type of collaborative, working-class innovation doesn't fit neatly into the great man theory of history. It's messy. It involves people who don't have impressive credentials or social status. It doesn't provide a clear narrative with heroes and villains, so it got erased, or more accurately, it was never properly recorded in the first place. The few technical drawings of Baltimore clippers that survive are often crude compared to the detailed plans produced by naval architects of the time. This isn't because the Baltimore builders were less skilled, but because they worked differently. They used models, half-models carved from wood that represented the hull shape. They used rules of thumb and practical experience. They built by eye and by feel as much as by calculation. This practical, experiential approach to ship design was incredibly effective, but it doesn't leave the kind of documentary evidence that historians love. There are no thick volumes of design theory, no mathematical treatises proving why the Baltimore Clipper worked so well. There's just the evidence of the ships themselves and the records of their extraordinary performance. And here's another layer of suppression. Many of the shipbuilders who created Baltimore Clippers for privateers and smugglers had every reason to keep a low profile. Building ships for illegal purposes, even if those purposes were tacitly accepted during wartime, wasn't the kind of thing you advertised. After the War of 1812 ended, and especially after the slave trade was internationally banned, having your name associated with Baltimore Clipper construction became problematic. Some builders who had made fortunes building these vessels suddenly became very quiet about that chapter of their careers. The hidden designers behind the Baltimore Clipper revolution were a diverse group of craftsmen, many of whom history has forgotten or never properly acknowledged. They were immigrants and native-born Americans, Europeans and Africans, educated and self-taught. They worked in wood and canvas and rope, using tools and techniques that had been refined over generations. They created one of the most successful ship designs in maritime history, and then they were written out of the story. But if these ships were so successful and so revolutionary, why would anyone want to erase them from history? To understand that, we need to talk about the governments that feared these ships and why they became a threat that needed to be suppressed. Imagine you're the British Admiralty in 1814. You command the most powerful navy the world has ever seen. You have ships of the line with over 100 guns each. You have frigates patrolling every ocean. You have centuries of naval tradition and the finest officers money can buy. And you're being humiliated by small, fast ships built in a backwater American port by craftsmen you've never heard of. This was the reality that the British government faced during the War of 1812, and it terrified them. The Baltimore Clipper represented something fundamentally threatening to the established order of naval power. It demonstrated that speed and agility could trump size and firepower. It showed that small, privately owned vessels could inflict strategic damage on a global empire. Most importantly, it proved that control of the seas didn't necessarily belong to whoever had the biggest navy. Let me give you some numbers to understand the scale of this threat. During the War of 1812, American privateers, most sailing Baltimore clippers, captured approximately 1,300 British merchant vessels. To put that in perspective, the entire United States Navy during this period had fewer than 20 warships. The privateers, operating independently with fast ships, did more economic damage to Britain than the official navy. British insurance rates for merchant vessels skyrocketed. Trade routes that had been considered safe for decades suddenly became dangerous. British merchants couldn't get insurance for voyages that would take them anywhere near American waters. The British government was forced to divert warships from other duties to convoy merchant vessels and patrol for privateers. This stretched their naval resources thin at a time when they were still dealing with the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. But here's what really worried governments. The Baltimore Clipper proved that naval power could be democratized. Before these ships, controlling the seas required massive investment in large warships, extensive naval infrastructure, and professional naval officers. It was something only wealthy nations could afford. The Baltimore Clipper changed that equation. A relatively small investment could produce a ship that could challenge, evade, or capture vessels from the most powerful navy in the world. This was revolutionary, and revolutions are always threatening to established powers. The British weren't the only ones worried. After the War of 1812, the United States government itself became concerned about Baltimore clippers. Why? Because these same fast ships that had been so useful during wartime became tools for pirates, smugglers, and slave traders during peacetime. The international slave trade was officially banned by Britain in 1807 and by the United States in 1808, but it continued illegally for decades. Baltimore clippers became the preferred vessels for slave traders because they could outrun the patrol ships trying to enforce the ban. This created a horrible moral and practical problem. The same ship design that had been celebrated for defending American commerce during the war was now being used for one of the most heinous trades in human history. The same speed that made these ships effective privateers made them effective slave runners. The U.S. government found itself in the awkward position of having to suppress a type of ship that had been built in American yards and had recently been lauded as symbols of American ingenuity and independence. European governments had similar concerns. Baltimore clippers and ships built on similar principles were being used by pirates in the Caribbean, smugglers in the Mediterranean, and rebels in South American independence movements. These fast ships enabled activities that governments couldn't easily control. They allowed small groups of individuals to challenge state monopolies on trade, to evade taxes and tariffs, and to operate outside the normal mechanisms of state power. From a governmental perspective, the Baltimore Clipper represented chaos. It represented the idea that ordinary people with the right tools could challenge established authority. There's also a class dimension to this fear. Naval power in the Age of Sail was aristocratic. Officers came from privileged backgrounds. Ships were owned by nations or wealthy merchants. There was a clear hierarchy, a social order reflected in the structure of naval warfare. The Baltimore Clipper disrupted this order. It was built by working-class craftsmen, often owned by middle-class merchants or privateer captains, and crewed by ordinary sailors who could become wealthy through prize money. It represented a more democratic, more accessible form of maritime power. European governments, still largely aristocratic in the early 19th century, found this profoundly threatening. There was also a strategic concern about technology proliferation. The Baltimore Clipper design was relatively simple and could be copied. It didn't require the industrial infrastructure needed to build a first-rate ship of the line. Any competent shipyard could build a fast schooner if they understood the principles. This meant that the Baltimore Clipper design could spread rapidly to potential enemies and rivals. And indeed, it did. By the 1820s and 1830s, fast schooners built on Baltimore Clipper principles were being constructed in shipyards around the Atlantic and Caribbean. Governments feared losing their monopoly on maritime power projection. The Baltimore Clipper suggested a future where any port city, any group of investors, any ambitious captain could create a vessel capable of challenging state authority on the seas. So, what do governments do when faced with a technology they fear? They attempt to control it, suppress it, or discredit it. In the case of the Baltimore Clipper, all three strategies were employed. Laws were passed, restricting the construction of certain types of ships. The association between Baltimore Clippers and illegal activities, especially the slave trade, was emphasized to taint the design's reputation. And perhaps most effectively, the story of these ships was simply not included in the official narratives of maritime history. When you read conventional naval histories, they focus on the great ships of the line, the frigates, the official naval engagements. Baltimore Clippers are relegated to footnotes or specialized texts. The message is clear. These ships were aberrations, not worth serious study. Certainly not representative of proper maritime development, but this suppression couldn't completely erase the truth. The Baltimore Clipper's influence on ship design continued, but it was sanitized and attributed to more acceptable sources. The principles were incorporated into later Clipper ships, but presented as if they had emerged from more respectable origins. The governments that feared these ships got their wish. The story was buried, the designers forgotten, and the revolutionary nature of what had been achieved was downplayed and obscured. But the ships themselves existed. They sailed, they dominated, and they changed maritime history. And the methods used to create them, those are the secrets that were really censored. That's what we need to talk about next. Now we're getting to the heart of the matter. What actually made the Baltimore Clipper so fast? What were the secret construction methods that produced these extraordinary vessels? The first secret is something called the Virginia model. This isn't widely written about in mainstream maritime texts, but it's crucial to understanding Baltimore Clipper design. The Virginia model refers to a tradition of fast schooner design that had been developing in the Chesapeake Bay region since the late 1600s. Chesapeake shipbuilders had been creating fast, shallow-draft vessels for generations, optimized for the particular conditions of the bay and coastal waters. These vessels needed to be fast to outrun pirates and hostile ships. They needed shallow draft to navigate the complex shoals and inlets of the Chesapeake. They needed to be seaworthy enough to venture into the Atlantic, but maneuverable enough to work in coastal and river environments. Over more than a century, Chesapeake builders had refined a distinctive hull form that balanced all these requirements. The Baltimore Clipper didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the culmination of generations of practical experimentation and refinement. But here's the secret part. This knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship and hands-on experience, not through written documents or formal education. It was folk knowledge, and folk knowledge is easy to suppress or ignore. The second secret involves the construction technique itself. Baltimore clippers used a method called plank-on-frame construction, but with some crucial differences from standard practice. The frames, the ribs of the ship, were placed closer together than in typical merchant vessels. This created a stronger, more rigid hull that could handle the stresses of high-speed sailing. The planking was also thinner and lighter than standard practice, reducing weight and increasing speed. But here's the critical part. The builders used live oak for the frames and ribs. Live oak is an incredibly strong, dense wood that grows in the southern United States. It's naturally resistant to rot and can handle enormous stress without failing. Using live oak allowed Baltimore clipper builders to create strong hulls with less weight than conventional construction methods. The British Royal Navy also recognized the value of live oak and tried to secure sources of it for their own shipbuilding. The fact that American builders had ready access to this superior material was a significant advantage that doesn't get enough attention in the historical record. The third secret involves the sail plan. Baltimore clippers typically used a schooner rig with 2 or more masts, all carrying fore and aft sails rather than square sails. Fore and aft sails, like the triangular mainsails and jibs you see on modern sailboats, allow a ship to sail much closer to the wind than square sails. This means a Baltimore clipper could make progress even when the wind wasn't directly behind it, giving it a huge tactical advantage. The specific proportions and placement of these sails on a Baltimore clipper were the result of careful refinement. The masts were raked, angled backward, which affected the ship's balance and handling. The boom of the mainsail was often extremely long, extending far beyond the stern of the ship, maximizing sail area. The total sail area on a Baltimore clipper was enormous relative to the hull size. These ships were over-canvassed by conventional standards, carrying more sail than would typically be considered safe. This gave them their tremendous speed, but also made them demanding to sail and potentially dangerous in rough weather. The fourth secret is about ballast. Baltimore clippers used iron ballast placed low in the hull to increase stability. The placement and amount of ballast was a carefully calculated decision that affected how the ship sailed. Too much ballast and the ship would be slow and unresponsive. Too little and it would be unstable and potentially capsize in strong winds. Getting this balance right required experience and skill, and the exact formulas were closely guarded by individual builders. Some Baltimore clipper captains would adjust their ballast based on the expected conditions of their voyage, removing weight for speed when they expected calm seas, or adding more when they anticipated rough weather. The fifth secret involves the use of copper sheathing on the hull below the waterline. Copper sheathing prevented marine growth and reduced drag, increasing speed. It also protected the wooden hull from shipworms, which could destroy a wooden vessel in tropical waters. Copper sheathing was expensive, and not all Baltimore clippers could afford it, but the fastest and most successful vessels used it. This was a technology borrowed from naval practice, but applied to private vessels, another example of how Baltimore clipper builders took the best innovations from wherever they could find them. The sixth secret is about the deck layout and weight distribution. Baltimore clippers typically had very low bulwarks, the walls around the edge of the deck. This reduced windage, the resistance caused by wind hitting the ship above the waterline. They also minimized the weight of deck structures and equipment. Everything was designed to be as light as possible without sacrificing functionality. This obsessive attention to weight reduction is reminiscent of modern racing yacht design. Cargo was also distributed carefully to maintain the ship's optimal trim. A Baltimore clipper loaded improperly would lose much of its speed advantage. The seventh secret, and perhaps the most important, was the knowledge of how to sail these ships. A Baltimore clipper in the hands of an inexperienced crew was not particularly fast. In the hands of a skilled crew that understood how to extract maximum performance, it was unbeatable. This experiential knowledge, how to trim the sails, when to reef in heavy weather, how to handle the ship in different conditions, was as much a part of the Baltimore Clippers' success as the design itself. And this knowledge wasn't written down. It was learned through experience, passed from experienced sailors to newer ones, demonstrated rather than documented. All of these secrets, these construction methods and design principles, were the real reasons Baltimore Clippers were so fast. But because they weren't documented in the ways that academic historians and naval architects recognized, they were easy to overlook or dismiss. The official narrative of maritime progress focused on systematic, documented innovation coming from established institutions. The Baltimore Clippers' success, rooted in folk tradition, practical experience, and working-class craftsmanship, didn't fit that narrative, so it was censored, not through active suppression in most cases, but through passive neglect. It simply wasn't included in the story that was told about maritime history and naval architecture. But the ships were real, and their performance was undeniable. Let's talk about just how fast these vessels actually were and the records they set. Let me give you some context for just how revolutionary the speed of Baltimore Clippers really was. In the age of sail, speed was measured in knots, nautical miles per hour. A typical merchant ship of the early 1800s might average 5 to 6 knots on a long voyage. A well-handled warship might sustain 7 to 8 knots. Baltimore Clippers routinely achieved speeds of 11 to 14 knots, and in ideal conditions, they could exceed 15 knots. This might not sound like a huge difference, but it was revolutionary. Speed doesn't just scale linearly. A ship that can maintain 12 knots instead of 6 knots doesn't just save half the time. It fundamentally changes what's possible. It can choose when and where to engage. It can escape from almost any threat. It can make voyages that would be unprofitable for slower ships. Let me give you some specific examples. The Chasseur, which I mentioned earlier, was recorded as achieving 15 knots in favorable conditions. On one documented voyage, it sailed from Havana to New York, a distance of about 1,200 nautical miles, in just over 4 days. That's an average speed of around 11 knots sustained over a multi-day voyage, which was extraordinary for the time. To put this in perspective, it would take a typical merchant ship of the era 10 to 14 days to make the same voyage. The Chasseur did it in less than half that time. The Pride of Baltimore, a Baltimore Clipper privateer, was documented as capturing 23 British vessels during a single cruise in 1814. This wasn't just about speed, but speed made these captures possible. The ship could chase down merchants, capture them, send them off with prize crews, and be on the hunt again, all faster than news of its presence could spread. The Anne McKim, built in 1833 and often described as the first true extreme clipper, was heavily influenced by Baltimore Clipper design principles. It was larger than typical Baltimore Clippers, but incorporated their hull design and sailing characteristics. The Anne McKim set speed records on runs to South America and around Cape Horn. During the illegal slave trade era, Baltimore Clippers and similar vessels would make runs from West Africa to Cuba or Brazil in as little as 30 to 35 days, under half the time a conventional merchant vessel would require. This speed was essential for the horrific business of slave trading, as it reduced the mortality rate among the enslaved people during the Middle Passage, and reduced the risk of being caught by anti-slavery patrols. This is one of the darkest chapters in the Baltimore Clipper story. The same engineering excellence that made these ships marvels of design also enabled terrible crimes against humanity. But the speed records continued even after the Baltimore Clipper era technically ended. The principles developed in these ships influenced the design of the California Clippers of the 1850s, which competed to make the fastest runs from New York to San Francisco during the Gold Rush. Ships like the Flying Cloud, which set the record for the fastest sailing ship passage from New York to San Francisco at 89 days in 1854, were direct descendants of Baltimore clipper design philosophy. The Flying Cloud incorporated the sharp bow, the raked masts, the large sail area, and the focus on speed over cargo capacity that Baltimore clippers had pioneered. The British tea clippers of the 1860s, which raced to bring the first tea of the season from China to London, also incorporated Baltimore clipper principles. Ships like the Cutty Sark, now preserved as a museum ship, show clear design elements derived from Baltimore clipper innovations. But here's what's remarkable. These later ships, the California Clippers and the Tea Clippers, are celebrated in maritime history. Books are written about them, museums are dedicated to them, they're remembered as the pinnacle of sailing ship development. The Baltimore Clippers, which pioneered the design principles that made these later ships possible, are largely forgotten. The speed records of Baltimore Clippers weren't just impressive in their time, even by modern standards, they're remarkable. A well-sailed Baltimore clipper could sustain speeds that many modern cruising sailboats would struggle to match. These ships achieved this performance with 19th-century materials and technology, with navigation systems that seem primitive by modern standards, and with no engines to fall back on when the wind died. It was pure sailing performance, optimized to an extreme degree, and it represented the peak of what was possible with wind power alone. But why did these speed records matter? Why did it matter that Baltimore clippers could sail faster than anything else on the ocean? That brings us to the economics of suppression, the financial and political reasons why the Baltimore clipper story had to be buried. Money. That's what this is really about. The Baltimore clipper threatened established economic interests, and those interests had the power to shape historical narratives. Let me explain how the economics worked. In the early 1800s, maritime commerce was the lifeblood of the global economy. Whoever controlled trade routes controlled wealth. The British Empire's power was built largely on its ability to move goods around the world more efficiently than anyone else. This efficiency came from Britain's large merchant fleet, its naval protection, and its global network of ports and trading posts. British merchant vessels weren't necessarily the fastest, but they were reliable, protected, and part of an integrated system that made trade profitable. Enter the Baltimore Clipper. These ships could move high-value, low-volume goods faster than any British merchant vessel. They could avoid British naval patrols and taxes. They could undercut established trading monopolies. If you were a merchant in Baltimore or Charleston, you could ship goods to the Caribbean, Europe, or South America faster and with less overhead than your British competitors. You didn't need to pay for naval protection because your ship was fast enough to avoid threats. You didn't need to follow established trade routes because your ship was weatherly enough to sail direct courses. This represented a fundamental threat to British economic dominance. If speed and agility could trump size and establishment infrastructure, the entire economic model that Britain's empire was built on could collapse. During the War of 1812, this threat became real. American privateers, mostly sailing Baltimore clippers, didn't just capture British ships for their own sake. They disrupted British trade to the point where it affected the British economy. British merchants pressured their government to end the war, in part because the economic damage from privateers was becoming unsustainable. A relatively small number of fast ships, operated by private individuals, inflicted strategic economic damage on the world's dominant empire. After the war, this economic threat didn't disappear. It morphed. Baltimore clippers and similar fast ships enabled new forms of trade that bypassed established systems. Smuggling became more profitable because fast ships could avoid customs enforcement. Piracy became more viable because fast ships could catch merchant vessels and escape from warships. Legitimate merchants who invested in fast ships could undercut competitors who used traditional vessels. This created economic pressure that threatened established trading houses and merchant cartels. From the perspective of established economic interests, this was chaos. It was unpredictable, uncontrollable, and threatening to their profits. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of the same established interests that publicly condemned Baltimore clippers privately invested in them or profited from them. British merchants, despite their government's efforts to suppress privateering and piracy, would sometimes quietly hire fast schooners for time-sensitive or questionable cargoes. Spanish colonial officials, while publicly fighting smuggling, would sometimes accept bribes to look the other way when Baltimore clippers arrived with contraband goods. Even American merchants, who had profited from Baltimore clipper privateering during the War of 1812, became concerned about these ships after the war, when they started threatening their own commercial interests. The economic situation was complex and contradictory. Baltimore clippers were simultaneously profitable and threatening, useful and dangerous. So what happened? How did established economic interests suppress the Baltimore clipper? First, they used regulation. Laws were passed restricting the construction of certain types of vessels, or regulating who could own ships suitable for privateering or piracy. These laws were selectively enforced, often targeting smaller operators, while giving exemptions or looking the other way for well-connected interests. Second, they used economics itself. As steam power began to emerge in the 1830s and 1840s, investment and development focused on steamships rather than sailing vessels. Steamships had the advantage of not depending on wind, making them more predictable for commercial schedules. Baltimore clippers, for all their speed, had a fundamental limitation. They sacrificed cargo capacity for performance. In an era where bulk goods were becoming more important to global trade, ships that could carry more were often more profitable than ships that could sail faster. The economic calculus shifted. A steamship that could reliably make scheduled runs, carry more cargo, and operate regardless of wind conditions became more attractive to investors than a fast sailing ship that required expert crews and could be becalmed for days. This wasn't just natural economic evolution. It was actively encouraged by governments and established commercial interests. Subsidies went to steamship lines. Naval contracts favored steam power. Maritime insurance rates were structured to favor conventional vessels over fast schooners. The Baltimore clipper was economically marginalized, pushed to the edges of maritime commerce where its specific advantages still mattered: smuggling, piracy, specialized high-value cargo, but removed from mainstream trade. Third, they used reputation destruction. The association between Baltimore clippers and the illegal slave trade was emphasized and repeated until it became the defining characteristic of these ships in the public mind. Never mind that the same ship design had been used to defend American commerce during wartime. Never mind that many Baltimore clippers were engaged in perfectly legal trade. The stain of the slave trade was used to discredit the entire class of vessels. This was effective because it was partially true. Baltimore clippers were used in the illegal slave trade, and that association was enough to taint the reputation of the design and the builders who created them. Respectable shipbuilders distanced themselves from the Baltimore clipper name. New designs that incorporated Baltimore clipper principles were given different names and different origin stories. The direct lineage was obscured. Fourth, and perhaps most insidiously, they used historical narrative control. The people who wrote maritime histories in the 19th and early 20th centuries were generally from elite backgrounds, connected to established institutions and supportive of the existing power structures. These historians focused on naval battles, famous warships, established shipyards, and properly credentialed designers. They wrote about what they considered important and prestigious. Baltimore clippers, built by working-class craftsmen for use by privateers, smugglers, and independent merchants, didn't fit the narrative these historians wanted to tell, so they were relegated to footnotes or excluded entirely. The economics of suppression worked. By the mid-19th century, Baltimore clipper construction had largely ceased. The shipyards that had built them had closed or shifted to other types of vessels. The craftsmen who knew the secrets of their construction had retired or died, often without passing on their specialized knowledge. And the story of what had been achieved was fading from memory, actively suppressed by interests that found it inconvenient or threatening. But suppression isn't the same as erasure. Some records survived, some stories were passed down, and some historians remained curious about these extraordinary ships. Which brings us to how the truth was systematically erased and how we can recover it. Now let me tell you exactly how they made an entire chapter of maritime innovation disappear from the history books. It started with the archive problem. When you research historical topics, you rely on primary sources, documents, drawings, letters, ship logs, all the paper trails that people left behind. But what happens when those records were never created in the first place or when they were deliberately destroyed? Baltimore clipper builders often worked from half models and experience rather than detailed written plans. When a shipyard closed, these models might be discarded or lost. The practical knowledge existed in people's heads and hands, not on paper. Without extensive documentation, future historians had little to work with. And when historians can't find sources, they tend to assume the topic isn't important, rather than questioning why the sources don't exist. This is what I call passive erasure. Nobody had to actively destroy records. They simply never existed in the forms that historians recognized as legitimate. But there was also active erasure. After the international slave trade was banned, there were very good reasons for people to distance themselves from anything associated with it. Shipbuilders who had constructed vessels that later ended up in the slave trade didn't advertise that fact. Business records were destroyed or edited. References to certain ships or clients were removed. The association between specific shipyards and Baltimore clippers was obscured or denied. Family histories were sanitized. Descendants of shipbuilders and privateer captains who had made fortunes during the War of 1812 or through other means downplayed or omitted the sources of that wealth. I've found examples of family papers where letters discussing ship construction or privateering ventures were removed from collections, leaving gaps in the chronological sequence. Someone went through and took out the inconvenient parts of the story. Then there's the problem of nationalist bias in historical writing. British historians, writing for a British audience, had little incentive to emphasize how small American ships had humiliated the Royal Navy. They focused on British victories and innovations, not British defeats and American successes. American historians had their own biases. By the late 19th century, American elites were trying to present America as a civilized, respectable nation ready to take its place among world powers. Stories about privateering, smuggling, and piracy didn't fit that image. The working class, sometimes rowdy, often morally ambiguous reality of early American maritime commerce was embarrassing. It was easier to focus on respectable topics like westward expansion, industrial development, and diplomatic achievements. Maritime museums played a role in this erasure, often unintentionally. Museums preserve what they consider important and worth preserving. Large warships, famous vessels, ships with connections to important historical figures, these got preserved. Small schooners built by unknown craftsmen for use by privateers and merchants rarely made it into museum collections. When Baltimore clippers did end up in museums, they were often misidentified or their significance was downplayed. The academic structure of maritime history also contributed to the erasure. Naval historians focused on navies, academic standards, proper documentation, verifiable sources. The Baltimore Clipper story, with its gaps in documentation and its association with illegal activities, didn't fit academic norms. Researchers who wanted to study Baltimore Clippers found it hard to get funding or academic support. Publications about Baltimore Clippers were relegated to specialized journals with limited circulation. The topic remained marginal within maritime historical studies. Popular culture also played a role. When movies, books, and television shows depicted the Age of Sail, they focused on dramatic naval battles, pirate adventures with square-rigged ships, and romantic tales of exploration. The Baltimore Clipper, a schooner designed for speed and profit rather than romance, didn't fit these narratives. It wasn't visually distinctive enough for popular media. It wasn't associated with the pirates and naval heroes that audiences wanted to see. So, the Baltimore Clipper disappeared from popular consciousness as well as from academic history. But here's what's remarkable. Despite all of this suppression and erasure, the truth didn't completely disappear. Some records survived, some researchers remained curious, and some descendants of Baltimore Clipper builders and sailors preserve family stories. In recent decades, there's been a revival of interest. Maritime archaeologists have studied Baltimore Clipper wrecks and learned more about their construction. Historians focusing on working-class history and economic history have rediscovered the importance of these ships. Replica ships have been built, most notably the Pride of Baltimore II, a modern recreation of a Baltimore Clipper that has sailed around the world demonstrating the capabilities of the original design. These efforts have begun to recover the erased history, but it's been a slow process. The systematic erasure was effective. Entire generations grew up without knowing about Baltimore Clippers or understanding their significance. And even today, if you pick up a general history of the Age of Sail or maritime innovation, you'll likely find Baltimore Clippers mentioned only briefly, if at all. The mainstream narrative still focuses on the big ships, the famous naval architects, the establishment institutions. The systematic erasure succeeded in removing the Baltimore Clipper from the central narrative of maritime history. It made these extraordinary ships seem like a footnote, an interesting detail, rather than a revolutionary development. But the truth is stubborn. The ships existed. They sailed. They dominated the Atlantic for decades. They influenced ship design for generations. And the story of what was achieved and how it was suppressed is a powerful lesson about how history gets written and rewritten. Which brings me to the final point I want to make, and the most important one. This isn't just about ships. It's about how innovation happens, who gets credit, and whose stories matter. So here we are. You've learned about the fastest ships to ever cross the Atlantic, the craftsmen who built them, the methods they used, and the forces that tried to erase them from history. But this story isn't finished. It's still being written, and this is where you come in. Every time you learn something that challenges the official narrative, every time you discover a story that's been suppressed or overlooked, you're participating in the recovery of history. You're fighting against the erasure that powerful interests always attempt. The Baltimore Clipper story teaches us something crucial. Innovation doesn't always come from the places we expect. It doesn't always follow the official channels. Sometimes the most revolutionary developments come from working-class craftsmen, from immigrants, from people operating outside the establishment. And those stories are the most likely to be suppressed, overlooked, or forgotten. Think about what other stories might be hidden in the gaps of official history. What other innovations have been attributed to the wrong people or forgotten entirely? What other achievements have been marginalized because they didn't fit convenient narratives? The Baltimore Clipper builders didn't have fancy credentials or royal patronage. They had skill, experience, and a willingness to experiment. They created something extraordinary, and then history tried to forget them. Don't let that happen. Don't let their story disappear again. I want you to do something right now. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Not just because I want more subscribers, although I obviously do, but because subscribing means you're choosing to stay informed about the stories that don't make it into mainstream narratives. Hit the like button. The algorithm needs to know that people care about this content, that there's an audience for historical truth that challenges official narratives. And here's the most important part. Leave a comment. Tell me what you think about this story. Tell me what other suppressed or forgotten chapters of history you want to learn about. Share your own family stories or local histories that challenge the mainstream narrative. Because here's the thing. History isn't just something that happened in the past. It's an ongoing conversation about the past, and everyone gets to participate in that conversation. Every comment, every share, every discussion is an act of historical recovery. You might be thinking, why does this matter? These ships sailed 200 years ago. The people who built them are long dead. Why should we care? We should care because the same forces that suppressed the Baltimore Clipper story are still operating today. Innovation is still marginalized when it comes from unexpected sources. Working-class knowledge is still devalued compared to academic credentials. Stories that challenge established power structures are still conveniently forgotten. Understanding how the Baltimore Clipper was erased from history helps us recognize when similar erasures are happening right now. It helps us ask questions like, whose innovations aren't being recognized? Whose contributions are being minimized? What stories are we not hearing because they're inconvenient for someone? The Baltimore Clipper teaches us to look beyond the official narrative, to value practical knowledge alongside theoretical knowledge, and to remember that the people who change the world aren't always the ones who get credit for it. These ships were built by people whose names we barely know. They were sailed by crews we can't identify. They changed maritime history, influenced global trade, and demonstrated principles of design that we still use today. And someone tried very hard to make sure you never heard about them. But now you have. You know the story. You know about the hidden designers, the secret methods, the speed records, and the systematic erasure. So what are you going to do with that knowledge? I'll tell you what I want you to do. First, subscribe and like, we've covered that. But second, and more importantly, go deeper. Look up Baltimore Clippers, read the specialized histories, visit maritime museums and ask about them. If you're near Baltimore, go to Fells Point, where many of these ships were built, and see if you can find the historical markers. Look for the replica Pride of Baltimore II when it visits ports, and go aboard if you can. Feel the deck under your feet. Look up at the raked masts. Imagine what it was like to sail one of these ships at 15 knots with the spray flying and the wind howling through the rigging. Make the story real for yourself. Don't just let it be information you consumed in a video. Let it be knowledge that changes how you see history. And then share it. Tell your friends about the Baltimore Clipper. Bring it up in conversations about maritime history or American history or innovation. Keep the story alive, because the best way to fight historical erasure is to refuse to forget. The best way to honor the hidden designers and forgotten craftsmen is to remember them and tell their story. Every time someone learns about the Baltimore Clipper, every time someone recognizes the significance of what was achieved, it's a small victory against the forces that tried to suppress this history. You're part of that victory now. You're part of keeping this story alive. So here's my challenge to you. In the comments below, tell me about another example of forgotten or suppressed innovation you know about. It could be from any field, technology, medicine, arts, anything. Share a story about someone who created something revolutionary but didn't get credit for it. Let's build a community of people who care about recovering lost history and recognizing forgotten innovators. Let's use this comment section to share knowledge and keep important stories alive. And if you made it this far in the video, thank you. Seriously, In an age of short attention spans and endless content, the fact that you watched a deep dive into 19th century maritime history means something. It means you care about learning real things, not just consuming entertainment. That makes you exactly the kind of person who can help fight historical erasure. That makes you someone who can ensure that stories like the Baltimore Clipper don't get forgotten again. So subscribe, like, comment, and most importantly, remember. Remember the ships that were too fast to catch. Remember the craftsmen who built them. Remember that history is written by the victors, but it doesn't have to stay that way. We can recover the truth. We can honor the forgotten innovators. We can ensure that the next generation knows the complete story, not just the sanitized version that powerful interests want them to know. The Baltimore Clipper sailed into history books and then was deliberately erased. But now it's sailing back into our collective memory, and you're part of making that happen. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being the kind of person who values truth over convenience and knowledge over entertainment. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll uncover another forgotten chapter of history that someone doesn't want you to know about. Until then, remember, the fastest ships in history weren't built by the people you'd expect, using methods you won't find in textbooks, and their story was almost erased from history. Almost, but not quite. Because now you know, and that changes everything.